Thank you very much for the kind introduction, as always. And hello everyone. I'm very excited and pleased to present the key findings of the study to you. And I'm also happy to see so many participants interested in the topic today. And indeed, there are many different angles how to look at the topic. So please feel free to comment or ask questions in the box. So following this agenda of the webinar today, I would first like to introduce Ecofys and NAVIGANT and then set the scene for the analysis of the EU energy and climate policy instruments. Then we will go over the distinct certificate mechanisms and markets, starting with carbon credits, then energy efficiency certificates, and then guarantees of origin for electricity and gas from renewable sources. So what we did then was we looked at these markets and at the EU energy and climate targets for 2030. And this enabled us to make rough projections of future certificate volumes and a comparison of these mechanisms in terms of CO2 abatement per certificate and abatement costs. This analysis then concludes with a summary of the status quo and the outlook for each of the markets. I for sure hope that along the way the slides and our analysis will trigger some questions or discussions, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. I'm sure that Fernando and Hans will do an excellent job in moderating the discussion as always. To bring some more depth and breadth, we have with us on the line my colleague from Berlin, Malte Gebhardt, who is managing consultant in the energy policies team. And I saw also on the chat, so online also, my colleague from Brussels, Edwin Hasen, Associate Director in the Energy Systems and Markets team. Malte will definitely join us for the discussion after the webinar. Okay, so just to make sure that you know who's claiming here to know something about certificate markets and instruments today, let me very briefly introduce Ecofys and NAVIGANT. So Ecofys was founded some 30 years ago, and we joined NAVIGANT Consulting last year, actually 2 years ago now. Our global footprint is now pretty much spread across the globe, and we have over 600 experts in the NAVIGANT energy practice. And what we are really doing is we're connecting the dots within that triangle between policy, the energy sector, and the consumers. And here you can see on the right side for who we are connecting these dots. And the list, of course, includes the energy-intensive industry. And we have a strong record of developing and implementing green energy strategies. In the center of the slide, you can see the so-called energy cloud, which is a piece of our thought leadership, and how we're having our experts at NAVIGANT Research involved in most projects. We can always rely on profound market intelligence throughout the energy sector. Okay, so enough of that. Let's take a look at EU energy and climate policies. So we all know the popular 2020 targets that were set out by the EU in 2007. So they were proposed early 2007 and then actually adopted in late 2008. They have listed explicit targets and instruments for 4 areas. The legislation became law in 2009. That included a revised directive for the emission trading system, a new renewable energy directive, and then in 2012 also a new energy efficiency directive. And these 4 areas are greenhouse gas emissions with a 20% reduction targets until 2020 based on 1990 emission levels, then 20% more energy efficiency, a 20% share of renewable energy, and there was also a 10% target for biofuels. We will talk about a bit more about the assumptions of these targets later, so let's first just take a look at the 2030 perspective now. After very long debates around these different areas and the targets, the European Commission came out with the so-called winter package in late 2016. It included a proposed recast of various legislations, including an ETS directive, renewable energy directive, electricity market regulations, energy efficiency directive, and a buildings directive. And in terms of numbers, for the time frame 2030, There's now a 40% reduction target for carbon emissions, 30% energy efficiency, and 27% renewables. Now, in order to achieve these targets, the EU has introduced various market-based policy instruments, and they are very different in nature. So for carbon emissions, we have a cap-and-trade system. For energy efficiency, some member states have introduced tradable energy savings obligations. And for renewable energy, the EU enabled voluntary markets for guarantees of origin. So yeah, let's take closer looks at these instruments, starting with CO2 certificates. So the basic idea here is the cap-and-trade system. So the reduction target, which is 40%, defines a cap for greenhouse gas emissions. This results in a limited number of emission allowances, which are allocated or auctioned to compliance sectors. And one emission allowance represents 1 metric ton of CO2. It also covers other greenhouse gases such as methane, but then with a global warming potential factor, you relate everything to carbon dioxide. Yeah, and then compliance companies must monitor and report the amount of their carbon emissions and hold equivalent emission allowances. Now, how do they get these allowances? So market participants can trade emission allowances with each other, which means that not each company needs to comply with the reduction target, but the market as a whole must comply with the overall cap. And the market mechanism and financial incentives aim to achieve the reduction target at minimum economic costs, which means that those emission reduction measures will be realized first, which have the lowest abatement cost. That's the whole idea behind it. All right, here you can see the sectoral and geographic scope of the EU emission trading system. So obviously it covers the energy industry, including power generation and heat generation, and also various energy-intensive industries, oil, steel, iron, ceramics, glass, pulp, paper. Many different industrial companies are covered by the ETS. And then for a little while, we have also included the civil aviation. But it includes actually only flights between airports within the European Economic Area. And since aviation is not part of Kyoto commitments, these emissions are accounted separately from the stationary installation. So it is included, but somewhat excluded from the system. All right, here you see the timeline for the ETS in terms of market supply and demand. So if you maybe start with focus on the orange bar that shows the available allowances. So we started out with allocated allowances. So they were just distributed to the companies pretty much free of charge and based on historic emissions data. And you see that over the years, just the orange bar was reduced, and then you see in dark orange a shift towards auctioning, which means that especially the power supply industry, they must actually acquire and pay for their emissions today. So as of 2013, when the third phase of the ETS started, you can see that less allowances are actually allocated free of charge. And the EU has moved towards actually selling the emission allowances. Then in dark red, as of 2008, and especially in the year of like 2012, in red you see the utilization of Kyoto offsets, which means that the compliance companies were not only allowed to use the EU emission allowances, but they could also buy certificates from the so-called offsets from international emission reduction projects in developing countries, and they were allowed to use them also in the system. So that just added more carbon credits to the system. And then if you look at the dark gray bars, that is the actual emissions in the ETS, and you see that in 2008, 9, 10, during the financial crisis and the euro crisis, there was a significant drop in emissions, and that actually left the market with a massive oversupply. In the background, in green, you see the cumulative oversupply, or the surplus in the system. So you can see that the surplus actually equals pretty much the emissions of the whole system in one full year. So that's where we are to date. We haven't had the 2017 data yet. All right, if you look at the prices over the same time, you can see that it's been a bumpy road, and the reason why the line actually goes down to zero in 2008 is because the carbon credits that were used from 2000 in the first phase of the ETS were not bankable, so you couldn't use them in the phases 2, 3, and also in the future in phase 4. That's why that price came down to zero. Yeah, and in the beginning, everybody was expecting high prices. Then actually the first emissions data came out, and there was a severe drop in prices because everybody saw that the emissions were actually much lower than expected. So the demand for offsets, for carbon credits was much lower than expected. And then you see another significant drop during the financial crisis, then the euro crisis. Then you saw some support of the price during the reform discussions. Then backloading, which means that some millions of these emission allowances was sort of backloaded, so they did not enter the market when they were supposed to enter the market. The EU, the European Commission, backloaded these credits and brought them into the market at a later stage than originally expected, allowing the market to sort of recover from the crisis. Yeah, that's pretty much it about the market development in the carbon sector. So this is another similar view, also including the surplus in light blue in the background. And it also includes a projection until 2030 during the fourth trading period of the emission trading system. And what you see in light green in the background are the allowances in MSR, that is the Market Stability Reserve. So the European Commission noticed that there's a strong imbalance between supply and demand. There's a big surplus, and they're now taking out some of the surplus into a Market Stability Reserve. So there are defined functions when and how many certificates will be taken out of the market when there's surplus, when the price is low, and then at a later stage when the market recovered and there's no surplus left, then these certificates from the reserve can actually re-enter the market. So this is sort of a mechanism to buffer the imbalance between supply and demand over time. All right, that's about the CO2 certificates. So of course, there's much more to talk about, but looking at the time, we rather keep it rather short to have more time in the end for the discussion. So energy efficiency certificates. You can see here the basic idea. So there are energy savings obligations, and these savings count towards energy efficiency obligations, and they can be traded as energy efficiency certificates, EECs, which are also known as white certificates. So that means that, for example, utilities, or in the case of Italy, also grid operators, have an obligation to realize energy savings, and they can do that in various sectors. In the residential sector, in the industry sector, also in the transport sector, somehow they have to reduce energy consumption, and they can pay for such measures and then receive these white certificates. And these white certificates can also be traded among utilities, also between a utility or just a pure retailer of these certificates. And these certificates are actually listed in a registry, and in this registry every certificate has some additional information with regard to what type of energy efficiency measure has been realized, when it was realized, and also other characteristics. So where do we see such schemes today? So we've picked here France, Italy, and Poland, even though there are some other countries who have implemented similar energy savings obligations. But in some cases, such as the UK, they only allow for a bilateral trade. So these three countries are really the only member states where we see an actual market of traded certificates. And you see that in France and Poland, the energy suppliers are obliged to comply by these energy saving targets. And in terms of sector, usually the final consumers, households, and also industrial consumers are covered or can be covered by the scheme in order to enable the utilities to realize these energy saving measures. So yeah, when it comes to this certificate mechanism, it's a bit more tricky to get into some data and to actually assess the market size and development. So in most countries, trade is very limited. Like I just said, in Bulgaria and UK, exchanges are very small. In France, the exchanges represented only a small percentage of the certified energy savings. In Poland, you also couldn't really find significant trade data, which leaves us with Italy, who appears to have really the only mature EEC market in the EU. Yeah, one explanation for this might be that in Italy the obligation is put on energy distributors instead of energy suppliers, who are more remote from end users, which favors outsourcing. So you could argue that that it's fairly easy for utilities to achieve these energy savings themselves without relying on external support, because they're very close to the end consumers and can implement energy efficiency projects and measures. All right. In terms of market prices, again, it's quite difficult. This is some data that we found for the Italian market. So in Italy, the price has been stable around 100 euros per certificate between 2009 and 2015. And then actually, so each white certificate in this case, in the case of Italy, is worth 1 ton of oil equivalent saved. Yeah, you could argue that due to low-hanging fruit being captured in an early stage and multiple regulatory reforms, the white certificate supply has been diminishing over the last years. With the energy efficiency obligations steadily rising, this has led to a significant increase in price over the last year. Okay, so off to the next mechanism, which are now for both electricity and gas guarantees of origin. So renewable energy certificates, we have talked about this already a lot actually, and you can find two webinars on this topic. One was called Introduction to Green Energy Sourcing for Industrial Customers. The other one was titled Recent Trends in the Debate on Corporate Renewable Sourcing. You can find the links on this slide, but also if you just go to the corporate energy sourcing topic on the Leonardo Energy website, you can, I'm sure you'll be able to find these webinars. So I will also keep this rather brief for today. But to give you an idea what this is, so you can see on this this graph again that on the left side you have the green power generator, which could be of course solar power or wind power, and they would produce electricity and feed it into the public grid. Then in the public grid everything mixes together, and then the green power consumer actually gets the regular green electricity like everybody else from the grid. But he can actually buy the right to claim the green electricity which was fed into the grid. And he can do that via a utility or a guarantee of origin retailer who has access to the registry. So when the green power generator generates green electricity, he can request the issuance of a guarantee of origin from an issuing body in a registry, and each certificate, so each guarantee of origin is linked to the certificate attributes like the name of the producer, the technology type, the year of installation, the year of production, and also other characteristics. And via this utility or retailer, the green power consumer can then acquire the guarantee of origin, and on behalf of him, the guarantee of origin is then redeemed for each megawatt hour. And so that is how that works. Yeah, we've seen that the use of renewable electricity across Europe has been rising for many years now. There's also no dip or end in sight. Yeah, and this actually pan-European development was triggered by the EU Renewable Energy Directive in 2009. So we used to have we still have national registries for renewable electricity and guarantees of origin, but they're pretty much linked now across all member states within Europe, which makes it easier to actually import and export green electricity in terms of certificates. So here you can see where green electricity is generated in this system of guarantees of origin. You can see that Norway and Switzerland, who have both a lot of hydropower, have the largest share of issuing guarantees of origin. And on the right side, you can see who is actually using, so buying and redeeming the guarantees of origin. There you can see larger shares in like France and Netherlands, for example. Okay, so in terms of technology, also again on the left side generation, the right hand consumption, so supply and demand pretty much. You can see that 3/4 are issued for hydropower projects, but just slightly less is actually demanded from that technology. Then you see wind power, power from waste, biomass, geothermal, and also others. Okay, so next to the electricity market, we have seen a market developing for guarantees of origin for renewable gas, so that is biomethane. The setup is very similar. Again, you have the green gas producer. It produces biogas, which is then processed further to biomethane, fed into the public gas grid, and you have the gas consumer at the other end, and then it goes the same route as with the electricity, green electricity. You have somebody paying for the certificate and somebody accessing the registry with all the information and redeeming one guarantee of origin for 1 megawatt hour of biomethane. So in terms of sectoral and geographical scope, so there are existing renewable gas certificate schemes, but they are for now all focused on biomethane. So you could also argue that in the future power to gas will come in and produce larger shares also from renewable sources. So that will then not really be biomethane in terms of coming from biogas, but it will be renewable methane produced with electricity from renewable sources. Yeah, some of the national systems, like in Germany, France, UK, Austria, Denmark, and also Switzerland, have already agreed to mutually recognize each other's guarantees of origin system for biomethane to facilitate cross-border trade and disclosure. So you can expect that you can expect to sort of history repeat itself if you take a look at what happened on the green electricity market. We can expect that similar things will happen to the green gas market across Europe. So for now, it's still not really a niche market, but you can tell that the supply and demand today pretty much focuses on these countries. So Germany, Sweden, Netherlands, Denmark, France, and Switzerland. If you just look at Germany, you can see that on this chart at the bottom that the use of biogas or biomethane has been increasing in Germany. And on the map, you can already see how the different countries are cooperating in terms of trading guarantees of origin for biomethane. So this is based on information from the registry of the German Energy Agency, which is in charge of managing the national register in Germany. So what you usually see in these markets and countries is that registries are pretty much privately founded and operated, but they tend to be recognized by the state. So an entity such as the German Energy Agency then has sort of the power to operate the system, and it is the recognized national system which will then be linked to other countries as well. Yeah, in terms of biomethane supply in Europe until 2030, so this is based on the Green Gas Grids initiative, and you can, as I just said, expect that the biomethane supply and also demand will grow in the future. In terms of prices, so the biomethane prices are not formally published or disclosed, but in the case of Netherlands, we found some price data. So there we found that 1 megawatt hour of biomethane is approximately between 4 and 8 euros, which equals 4 or 8 cents per cubic meter. So in the winter package of the European Commission, you see that in the proposed Renewable Energy Directive that the Commission really wants to advance the market and system for renewable gas, just like the renewable electricity market has developed over the past years. Okay, so that's it for the basic ideas about these certificate instruments. And yeah, what we then wondered was how do these different instruments compare in terms of volumes and CO2 abatement. And we came up with this calculation sheet. I will not talk you through this one by one, but just to give you an idea how we approach this topic. So starting with the greenhouse gas emissions on the left again. So that is the cap and trade system. You have the relative target for 2030 of 40%. That relates to the emission levels in 1990. And if you take those emission levels, that greenhouse gas inventory of the EU in 1990, and multiply it by 40%, then you can see that more than 2 billion tons of CO2 will be reduced by 2030. That's the target. But that refers to the annual emissions. So that leaves for the sectors which are covered by the emission trading system, so by the cap and trade system, that leaves a number of carbon credits in 2030 of 1.33 billion EU allowances. The CO2 intensity, so the value of each certificate is 1 ton CO2 by definition. That is pretty clear. And the abatement costs, if you want to call it that way, so the price for 1 ton of CO2 is 750. It actually just climbed up to, I think, even above 9. So we just saw a very steady, a very sharp increase just recently, just after we drafted these figures. It can also just go back down in a couple of weeks. So we stick with the 750 for now, which is also the basis, more or less the basis for most of the analysis that the European Commission did. So trying to approach, trying to go through the same logic for the tradable savings obligations. So for energy efficiency, we looked at the different sectors. So we excluded the transport sector pretty much because we didn't see much of a certificate mechanism or market for the transport sector. So for now on, we focus on the electricity and on the heat market. So the 30% target actually refers to about 21% reduction target in terms of primary energy consumption in terms of electricity, and 43% in terms of heat. Then relating that to terawatt hours for the full amount of energy savings. Then again for each sector, and then assuming that half of these energy savings will be realized through energy savings obligations. So that is also mentioned in the winter package, that half of that could be realized through energy savings obligations instruments. We then came down to a number of white certificates of 40 million in the electricity savings and 160 million in heat savings. Then looking at the carbon intensity of electricity and heat, and then relating that into abatement per certificate and abatement cost, we came down to much higher numbers of 71 euros per ton of CO2, 43 for energy efficiency measures in the heat sector. And this is actually based on the market price we saw in Italy of 100 euros. Then looking at the voluntary markets for guarantees of origin, so renewable energy, that includes electricity and also heat, so biomethane. If you put the 27% target on the final energy consumption, you would end up with more than 3 billion guarantees of origin in 2030, split into electricity and heat. Again, transport we didn't include in the analysis because it doesn't play a role today and probably not in the future. So following the same logic, you end up at prices of just 41 cents per ton of CO2 for renewable electricity, and around 25 euros per ton of CO2 for biomethane. So putting this into context and comparing the potential sizes of or volumes of the certificate markets in the year 2030, you see that the market for guarantees of origin on the right side in dark green is pretty large, but that assumes that all of the renewable energy is accounted for by guarantees of origin, which is of course debatable. Then the same applies to the energy savings obligations, assuming that actually half of this target would be achieved through tradable energy savings. But it would mean only, more or less, it would be lead to only 283 million white certificates in the market. And the number of EUAs, so European Union allowances for carbon emissions, would be 1.333 billion in that year. And then again, this quantity of certificates equals the same number in terms of tons CO2. So if you look at abatement, it doesn't really mean abatement in the sense that this volume of the certificate market reduces that amount of ton CO2. It just means that this amount of CO2 certificates equals this amount of ton CO2. We did this just to make it comparable also across the other sectors, because you see in green that 3.245 billion guarantees of origin probably lead to more or less the same amount of carbon reduction, or it would mean the same amount of ton CO2. Of course, these different sectors are not at all additive, so it doesn't mean that if you just do all of this, you can add up all these carbon abatement and you would end up like 3 billion tons CO2, because these sectors are of course very much interlinked. So if you just look at the electricity sector, in the sector, you can generate energy efficiency certificates by just reducing your electricity consumption. You can also, in the electricity sector, generate guarantees of origin if you produce electricity from renewables. And at the same time, this sector, the electricity sector, meaning the power plants, are also covered by the third policy instrument, which is the cap and trade system. So you see that everything is very much interlinked, and you cannot just simply add everything up. And additionality in itself is a very big topic, so you have to always question which measure, which activity now actually leads to carbon abatement. But I think this is a pretty good overview to really get a sense for the potential volume of these markets and what they actually mean in terms of CO2 intensity. Okay, so putting this again, making it comparable on a graph of CO2 abatement per certificate. So while carbon credits always represent 1 ton CO2, the carbon abatement realized through other certificate markets needs to be calculated and based on assumptions. So that is why you see a projection range and not just a bold, just a very direct bar. So energy efficiency certificates are usually technology neutral and represent savings in primary energy of 1 ton oil equivalent in any of the covered sectors. So that is according to the Italian scheme, just assuming that across the EU lots of similar certificate schemes would be introduced. And then guarantees of origin are issued, traded and redeemed in the respective sector only. So you have a very sharp distinction between biomethane and electricity, and in the energy efficiency certificates, you an energy savings from heat demand or from electricity demand could also just be the same in terms of a certificate. For the reduction of natural gas consumption or its replacement by renewable gas, the CO2 abatement results from the emission factor of natural gas and the primary energy factor. And these factors remain unchanged. So in 2030 they will be the same as they are today. But you have to take them into account to actually calculate the carbon abatement. Then for the reduction of power consumption or its replacement by renewable electricity, the CO2 abatement results from the grid emission factor for the final energy consumption and the primary energy factor. And they are not stable, so they will change. The average grid emission factor is expected to decrease from 0.3 today down to 0.18 or 0.20 in 2030, and the primary energy factor for electricity is expected to be reduced from 2.5 today down to 2.4 or 2 in 2030. So that also has an impact on the amount of energy efficiency certificates that you receive if you have reduced the electricity consumption, because the target, the EU target, refers to primary energy consumption. So the correlation between the CO2 abatement per certificate with the grid emission factor is positive, but for the primary energy factor it is negative. So in the case the primary energy factor is reduced, which it will be, and if it is reduced relatively stronger, then the grid emission factor decreases, then the CO2 abatement per certificate actually goes up. So we just don't know what is going to happen. There is some science behind it, but it's pretty much comes down to a decision that has to be made. All right, the primary energy factor of electricity today, based on analysis and research, is now, I don't know, 2.0, for example. Could also be 1.4, 1.8. That will that only time can show, I guess. Then in terms of renewable electricity, so the average emission factor for electricity from conventional energy is estimated to decrease by 5% from 0.73 today to 0.69 in 2030. And that will just be based on increase in generation efficiency, also according to a study from the European Commission. So you can see that we have assumed that if you have a guarantee of origin, you are actually replacing the electricity from more carbon-intensive power plants, from coal-fired power plants, or just pretty much the mix between coal, gas, also nuclear, altogether. Whereas when you reduce electricity consumption, so when we talk about energy efficiency certificates, we have assumed that you reduce the carbon emissions according to the overall grid emission factor. So that is including renewables. So for assessing the guarantees of origin, we looked only at the electricity mix excluding renewables, because we say, all right, this is apparently only replacing the more carbon-intensive production. And when you look at just reducing electricity in general, then we looked at the general grid emission factor, which actually includes renewables also. Okay, enough of that. There's a lot of theory behind it. We then just added the information we had on the prices per certificate, and then came down to this graph for CO2 abatement cost. So the prices per certificate and how much carbon emissions they relate to. So you see for the carbon credits, we are today around €9, I think, and everybody's expecting this to increase to anything between 15 and 40 euros per ton of CO2. If you look at energy efficiency, you see the much higher prices that you already saw on the calculation sheet. But this can go either way. So if the primary energy factor remains high, then and the prices may go down again, then you would see lower abatement costs also in this market. If the other way comes a reality, then you can you may see prices as high as 300 euros in theory. Then for guarantees of origin, the prices for renewable electricity are rather low and are expected to remain low, even though there are some discussions going on around additionality and how to account for certificates from subsidized projects. For biomethane, it is a bit more unclear where the the prices will go, but we expect a price range between 20 and 35 euros per guarantee of origin in 2030. Okay, so putting this all together in conclusion, so we have three very different certificate mechanisms. We have the cap and trade system to realize the 40% reduction target for greenhouse gas emissions. We have tradable savings obligations to realize the 30% energy efficiency target. And then we have voluntary markets for tradable guarantees of origin to account for renewable energy from renewable electricity and also renewable gas. For the carbon market, the EU ETS is today covering actually 45% of the greenhouse gas emissions, and it covers energy industry and energy intensive industry in 28 countries. The outlook is policy measures aim to absorb the massive certificates oversupply, and the lower cap will reduce the market volume and drive up the prices. For energy efficiency, only 3 countries have an energy efficiency obligation scheme in place allowing really tradable certificates. The Italian is pretty much the only mature energy efficiency certificate market and is expected to grow further. It is, I think, unlikely that other markets will evolve, as utilities are usually able to meet obligations organically, so they're very close to the end consumers, and there may not be a need to actually trade these certificates. Then for guarantees of origin, in terms of electricity across Europe, registries for renewable electricity are in place and they are connected. The use and also the pan-European trade of guarantees of origin is increasing. The market will grow significantly with the increasing share of renewable electricity, which will be around 50% by 2030. And the European Commission proposal will mean substantial changes to the mechanism at the same time when we talk about additionality and who actually gets a guarantee of origin under which conditions. In terms of biomethane, Germany is leading the growing European market in terms of production capacity. Several other countries also operate national registries. Based on the EC proposals, renewable energy targets and consumer interest, market size for renewable gas can be expected to grow significantly across the European Union. So that's it for the conclusion. You can see in the backup some more some references and also our contact details and ways to of course connect with us. That was it. As I said, you find the references, but I'm sure you'll find a way to get in touch with us if you need us at any time. So I want to thank you very much for your patience and attention. Fernando or Hans, I would say back to you, and let's see what questions we have.